It's a misnomer that because one has a fascination with history or fancies themselves a historian, that they just know everything, when the reality is the most enlightening aspect with regards to a love of history can be the discovery of new things. And in this case, I learned a lot, finding myself misguided a few times only to learn even more. The history of 1800s Portland, Oregon is a mix of detailed accounts and minuscule information, and the further back one goes, the more obscure it can get. And speaking of earlier Portland history, one night I sat scanning this fairly well-known rendering of the city produced in 1879. I looked around just for anything of interest and found my eyes wandering the gulches that Tanner Creek used to roll through, an interesting history all its own. But as my eyes wandered, I crossed one bridge, then another, and then several others just within this image. Bridges that were long gone a long time ago, and I got hooked. The focused history of Portland's bridges tends to hone in on those crossing the Willamette River, and thus the first commuter bridge to cross the river, the original 1887 Morrison Street Bridge, is deemed many a person's starting point. If you do an online search asking the question, "What was Portland, Oregon's first bridge?" most results lead you to the first Morrison Bridge, and it makes sense as this was the one that connected the east and west sides of town across the river, and the Morrison Bridge was substantially larger and more elaborate than its predecessors. But even by the time this bridge was built, the city of Portland had been around for more than 35 years. This got me to thinking about all those old bridges that must have existed before then. So my objective here is to focus specifically on the locations and the history of Portland's bridges that must have been erected no later than 1887, and also the locations, with one large exception, must be where there are no longer bridges today, and haven't been for a long time. Lots of bridges in existence today had bridges on that same site that predated them. But if I go into those, we start covering a history that goes well beyond 1887. So those are the rules I'm trying to stick to, and odds are, with how small and short-lived some of these early bridges were, I might miss a few, especially where there's practically no to absolutely no information available about them. And even the ones I will discuss, some have a rather obscure history. But the focus is not establishing an inventory so much of old bridges as opposed to just discussing Portland's early bridge history. And for the purpose of this video, I will mainly have it in 3 sections: a general history, the west side bridges, and then the east side bridges. The first bridge made of steel in Portland was the original Steel Bridge, built in 1888. And thus in this case, we will be discussing the wood generation of the city's bridges. Even the original Morrison Bridge before it was a wooden truss swing span bridge. Another key difference between the Morrison and those that came before it was the fact that it could swing open, obviously to allow ships traveling down the river to pass through. While several of the bridges that came before it did cross waterways, these were mainly creeks and sloughs, some with stretches barely wide enough for a rowboat. I found general bridge references dating back to the late 1850s, with the main bridge often discussed being one that ran along Front Avenue. Whether there were other bridges in existence at this time, it seems this was the first main bridge in town, with newspaper articles often referencing it as the bridge. 1860s articles clarified that this bridge was located at Jefferson Street, while others said the bridge ran between Madison and Columbia Streets, wherein Jefferson is the only street running between them. By 1866, the bridge had been heavily damaged and plans were put forward to fill what was called a gully that the bridge went over. The last reference I found to this bridge came from a January 23, 1867 Oregonian, wherein the bridge was still described as damaged, with all traffic being diverted. I did not find another reference to a Front Street bridge until 1871, and that was in reference to a new bridge that was planned to cross Markham Gulch to the south of this previous bridge. I found the most detailed description of this particular bridge's past in an 1864 Oregonian article. In it, they state a log bridge was constructed on Front Avenue between Jefferson and Columbia Streets way back in 1851, perhaps making it Portland's first bridge, as the town was only a couple years old at this point, with less than 1,000 people living there. The bridge was nearly destroyed by a flood, or as they called it, accumulated waters, after which time people still sometimes used it, a common theme in these early bridges. Things falling apart, it's okay, you'll still find a way to get across. It would ultimately end up barricaded, cutting off what was at the time considered the town's main thoroughfare. It's also important to realize that in these early years, the streets that ran along the river ran right up against it, sometimes running directly into it. We can see that in this 1866 map, where Front Street on the west side and Water Street on the east side were very close to the water. In some of the city's earliest pictures looking down Front Street, we can see ships docked on the edge of the river that look like they're practically in the middle of the street due to this closeness. So Front Avenue, as it later would be known, having a bridge in these earlier years makes sense, and there too would be a long bridge along Water Street sometime later. So Front Street, now in line with the Nadeau Parkway, may have been where it all started, and we know it was a, quote, log bridge, which is par for the course with these early bridges. There's very few pictures of any of these earliest ones, and most of my discoveries were made looking at drawings done of the city, like this aforementioned 1879 piece, this 1890 piece, and this map of Holliday's edition. Finding drawings of bridges and doing research to try and verify them, while doing searches to see if I could uncover other bridges that existed but were not found in these images. And most of these bridges done in the 1860s and on into the 1870s were often done to roughly the same quality as a dock. Artist renditions of them show simple, fairly narrow wood bridges with log or timber supports and crossing wood planks. Seldom did these early bridges have any kind of railing. They were almost all wood. Of course, timber was one thing in the Portland area that was not hard to come by. And these bridges, at least some, were necessary. If you were just one guy walking along, yeah, you might be able to make it down the gulch and, let's say, across Tanner Creek to the other side. But what if you were a family with little children? What if you had a horse and carriage transporting hefty amounts of merchandise? Trying not to get stuck in a waterway or in some mud, or just trying to climb out of a given gulch. While Portland was a city that flooded almost annually, and the locals took it in stride, it was still not exactly to everyone's liking that they'd have to trudge through some waterway just to get somewhere right around the corner. And on a wider scale, these bridges made it easier to access smaller, but still surrounding areas. People had begun settling in the Beaverton area west of town as far back as the 1840s, and the Gresham area to the east was settled in 1851. And even having a bridge across Stevens Slough to the southern edge of East Portland made it that much easier to reach places to the south, like Milwaukee and Oregon City, at least without having to get wet. These early bridges may have been simple, but they were a critical element in those early years of Portland's development. And there were a lot of them. We must remember that with people mostly traveling on foot or by horse and carriage, they didn't travel very fast. And as the city grew, at major crossing points, such as Tanner Creek and Sullivan's Gulch, there would sometimes be bridges every few blocks. But while waterways were almost always the reason for building these early bridges, along with the gulches and depressions they existed in, the common locations for these bridges differed from the west side of the river to the east side. This is because there was only one key body of water on the west side, that being Tanner Creek, which ran into Couch Lake to the north end of town into the 1890s. But Tanner Creek wrapped around the outside of the original Portland area. Because of this, most of the early bridges on the west side were on the outskirts of town. This included several bridges to the south end of town, namely on Front, 1st, and 4th Streets. But bridges still exist in this area now, only over Interstate 405 at these three sites. The east side is quite different in that there were several waterways branching off the Willamette, including the Stevens Slough, Hawthorne Slough, Montgomery Slough, and even a small slough running through Sullivan's Gulch. Because of this, the early bridges on the east side were scattered around, but also right in the middle of town, as opposed to being exclusively to its outskirts. As the years would pass, the bridges became larger and sometimes more durable, but something that hit just about every single one of them was the constant need for maintenance. Often bridges in dire need of repair would be, quote, repaired, only to be in dire need of fixing only months later. The primary reason this frequently happened had to do with two things: how these early bridges were built in the first place, and the strain put on the town by always having to invest money in fixing these bridges. It became commonplace for the city to put the cost of fixing bridges on the property owners surrounding a given bridge. The funding the city had to build and repair bridges was always strained, and there was always a handful of bridges in need of fixing at the same time. The manner and location where many of these bridges were done played a key role in the constant need for maintenance. Built mostly over gulches, these bridges would be erected by implanting the timber supports into the land below. This allowed for gradual settling into the earth, with the weight over these supports pushing them down. And with these supports gradually settling, the bridges themselves tended to dip downward, with one reported instance of a bridge dipping down some 8 feet. The common case of timber supports settling was almost matched by the frequent need to replace these supports. They often rotted and decayed away, not only making settling even more possible, but making the bridges themselves unstable. The number of references I found to decaying supports was almost unending, and obviously the wood planks that people used to cross a given bridge would also face problems with decaying into instability. And as sidewalks became more common on these bridges for pedestrians walking by foot, they too were made of wood that sometimes was not set in place properly. And again, it would also be a while before railings were sometimes included on these bridges to prevent people from just falling off the side if they walked too close to the edge. They really did just look like glorified docks, but not necessarily built with the same durability. Honestly, with how many of these bridges became beyond dangerous and were left that way for some time, Something I am surprised I did not stumble upon more often were reports of people falling off of or through these bridges, perhaps to their deaths. These events did happen, but not as often as one might think. And it wasn't just the bridges. Even if a bridge was closed and barricaded, people still tended to use them under the old adage of, well, I'll be alright. Local children also loved hanging out on these bridges, again, sometimes regardless of one's sturdiness and just sightseeing below. This would lead to the occasional newspaper article telling kids to not engage in such reckless endeavors. But, as mentioned before, over time the bridges did often increase in size and namely width, as the city's population continued to grow at a rapid rate, from less than 3,000 people in 1860 to over 46,000 people by 1890. More traffic, increased railroad needs, as well as the development and increase of streetcar lines, with the first one starting in 1872. But even as they grew, these bridges remained fairly modest in appearance, until the Morrison Street Bridge was completed and began operations in 1887. It was a structure unlike any before it, and really began shifting the attitudes about how bridges should look. It was also the first commuter bridge connecting the east and west sides across the Willamette River. So with the first Morrison, we would also begin experiencing the departure in bridge construction from this previous style, as only makes sense. The next year, 1888, again would see the city's first steel bridge being completed. So not only were bridges becoming more elaborate, but they would also become stronger as more and more bridges would be made of steel in the future instead of wood. But aside from how bridges were to change, it doesn't explain what happened to all of these early bridges, at least the ones that were still standing by the time the likes of the Morrison and steel bridges came along. Well, it's fairly simple. Obviously, over time, they would have all probably been rebuilt as steel bridges, as was done in the early 1900s, where today's Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard and Grand Avenue cross Sullivan's Gulch. But the fact of the matter is that they all went away forever because they stopped being necessary due to several fill projects that saw the gradual removal of the likes of Stevens Slough, Hawthorne Slough, and Couch Lake. Even Tanner Creek would be covered over and start running underground by the 1890s. With no waterways to cross, these bridges slowly vanished, one by one. As mentioned before, it is likely the first bridge that we can verify existed in Portland ran along Front Avenue, originally built around 1851. There were references to other possible bridges dating back to the mid-1860s, such as one on Main Street near 2nd. Aside from these, of the bridges along the west side of the Willamette River, the next oldest one I was able to find dates back to September of 1867, with plans reportedly to construct a bridge on F Street, or what is Flanders Street today, crossing over Tanner Creek. While this was the initial plan, a bridge would actually be constructed one block south on E Street, or what is now Everett Street. There was very little information out there on this bridge, and it may not have lasted even that far into the 1880s, if that. The latest information I found on it was from an 1878 article discussing money to be appropriated to build a sidewalk on the north side of the bridge. So, aside from the first known bridge that was on Front Street back then, that dated back to the 1850s, the oldest bridge I cover is actually the one that oh my god, the streetcars are colliding, they're meeting. Okay, that was exciting. Anyway, the oldest one I cover, as far as the bridges that I'm primarily discussing in this video, was the E Street Bridge, which dates back into the late 1860s. And I mean, you want to talk about an area looking nothing. I mean, we are almost 160 years into the future from when this bridge was built, but still. Because I'm walking into the Pearl right now, and I mean, the area I'm going to be in is kind of to the southern end of the Pearl, but it's still, you know, it looks how it looks. And I'm talking about a bridge built in the 1860s. So you think this tiny little gulch, little creek running through it, this little kind of thrown together dock-like bridge just crossing over it, just a little slice of hidden heaven. Well, here it is today. This is 11th right here, and Everett is this crossing street right here, or E Street. So the bridge would have started here and crossed down to 11th, or this is 12th Avenue, and this is where it would have crossed Tanner Creek. So the gulch would have crossed right under here. And the bridge, I don't know if it ran the whole length. A lot of these bridges I don't think were that big enough that they ran the whole length of a block, even in Portland's kind of smaller city blocks, but that's generally how they're described. The bridge crossed E Street here between 11th and then 12th. So here we're approaching the intersection at 12th, and it's where it would have come to the other end of the gulch and helped get people coming from, you know, more in the city to parts slightly further east. Which, I mean, that was the main purpose of most of these West Side bridges. Pretty much all of them were to get people across Tanner Creek. There was no way to avoid the creek as it kind of wrapped through here. And this would have been, again, the oldest bridge I cover. It would have crossed this city block right here. But while a bridge would not be built along F Street at this time, there is actually a bridge existing roughly in the same area that this bridge would have been. Yeah, this is the Flanders crossing, which is fairly new. There he is, the legend. Well, I'm sure a lot of people already know that Matt Groening, the guy who created Simpsons, is from Portland, and a lot of his characters' names are taken from streets in Portland, such as Flanders Street, which this would be if there's vehicles crossing, but that's Flanders Street right there. I've mentioned Tanner Creek a few times here and not really delved too much into why, aside from the fact that bridges crossed it. But Tanner Creek, now covered over and still running, just underground through the city, started to the south end of town, branching off the Willamette through Markham Gulch before wrapping around through the area just west of today's downtown area, and then returning to the Willamette near where the Broadway Bridge is today. Again, the oldest bridge I found reference to specifically crossing this creek was on E Street, built around 1867, but two other bridges were not far behind. In January 1869, the B Street Bridge would open, establishing a primary route across Tanner Creek and leading people further west. Becoming Burnside Street in 1891, this bridge crossed the creek's gulch in close proximity to where Burnside crosses the I-405 freeway today. This bridge project would face delays at first, leading people to be skeptical about a bridge ever crossing the Willamette if they couldn't get one done across this little creek. When it was completed, it reportedly cost around $500 and had a span about 50 feet long and a width of 20 feet. Not long after this bridge was completed, a bridge was planned for nearby Washington Street, arguably the most prominent east-west running street in Portland in those early years. This bridge would be completed in September 1871. These two bridges were completed at a point less than 2 blocks from where B Street and Washington met, creating an interesting setup with two bridges running side by side and almost into one another. It might seem counterproductive to build two bridges at this time so close together, but we must remember that these two streets go in different directions, despite being considered east-west traveling streets. So if one was down by the waterfront in the heart of town, these two streets were several blocks apart. This meant lots of potential traffic from completely different places, going down B Street and then going down Washington Street. And now I'm approaching Burnside, where the most prominent of these early West Side bridges had to be right around the corner down here, which is where the B Street Bridge and the Washington Street Bridge crossed, practically right next to each other, because it's right by where they merge together. And it's the general vicinity of where it crosses I-405. By the way, this black building here, the most famous version of the song Louie Louie was filmed, I believe, on the second floor. Just other history. I'm now crossing 13th on Burnside. And the B Street Bridge started just past this intersection, and it continued that way close to where 15th Avenue would be today. So it ran almost 2 blocks because this next light up here is 14th. So it ran between 13th and 15th. So we'd be on the bridge right now crossing the Gulch. And now we've got the Crystal Ballroom here today. And again, they pretty much filled in the Gulch many times long, more than a century ago. But yeah, this is kind of one of the areas where the Gulch widened a bit, kind of wrapped around and widened. Now today, Washington Street does not cross here. It ends right there. Even up there, you can't really read it, but it says Washington Street, so it ends there. So it would have crossed diagonal kind of across here and connected with B Street right up here. And we would have been coming probably right about here, would have been pretty close to coming to the end of the Gulch, because Washington Street and B Street, Burnside Street today, would sync up right here at 15th. And the two bridges crossed the Gulch here. And by the time they crossed and the bridges ended, they hadn't quite come together yet. So since they come together right here at 15th, both bridges would have ended right before we got to this intersection, or where exactly 15th might have been way back when. It may have been a little bit more this way, a little bit more that way. And so you can see it's kind of a goofy intersection because you've got a little sliver of Washington coming in here, and that's where Washington Street ends. But you can see where Washington Street should have been because there's still a reference to it right here. This is, well, I mean, I guess it does technically start again right next to me, but you can see Washington Street comes through here, and if you look through the gates, the fencing, whatever you want to call this here, you can see like that's literally Washington Street, like coming right towards us. So the Washington Street Bridge would have come pretty much right at me. And then the B Street Bridge would have been right here. So you can see in maps, they practically, by the time they finish crossing the Gulch, they practically are already almost connecting. And it's because one would have been right here and one is right there. Because of where they stood and when they were built, these two bridges were synonymous with one another, right down to necessary maintenance. The Washington Street one had it particularly rough, facing closure for repairs due to supports settling after being open less than a year. And the next year, both it and the B Street Bridge would be seriously damaged by a storm. The gulch down by Tanner Creek had been a gathering place for Chinese immigrants, but with the construction of these bridges, something new started to grace the gulch. Trash. Lots and lots of trash. By 1874, this was regarded as a serious issue. Something that had helped the spread of two major Portland fires in the 2 previous years was the amount of trash that people would store in their homes and businesses, in particular in their cellars. So major trash buildups were a source of concern for locals, beyond how bad it made things look. Things peaked on September 3rd, 1880, when one of these trash holes, as they were called, was set on fire, putting these bridges in danger. By this time, with the waste and the constant need for repairs, the sentiment around town was that these bridges should be torn down and the gulch filled in, allowing people to still cross at that location. Despite ongoing efforts to keep repairing these bridges and keeping them functional, as they often settled in the gulch's soil, by 1882, they finally acknowledged the truth and started filling the gulch around these bridges. This would be work that predated 1890's efforts that led to covering up the whole creek and eliminating that gulch. Such would make the B and Washington Street bridges a thing of the past by the early 1880s. But just before this fill work took off, there was another bridge being constructed, one of few on the west side that was actually within the heart of the city, albeit to its northern edge. And this is also where I had to acknowledge my own confusion as I learned a little more about things I'd previously known little about. So, of course, one of the things I love about history is discovering new things and diving into areas that I previously haven't really gone into, which definitely happened over the course of putting this particular video together. But one of the things in particular I stumbled onto, and outside of bridges, were all these waterways that no longer exist. And because I haven't really studied that, didn't really know much about them, a lot of these, with the exception of maybe Tanner Creek, I didn't really know where they were. So the 3rd Street Bridge was something that really threw me off, and actually for a long time I was researching it under the guise that it was in a completely different place than where it actually was. Here's what happened, because there is a logical path, and fortunately I found my way to where it actually was. So as I'm looking at these old maps and old imagery, there's an image or drawing done of the city from 1890, and it shows a bridge crossing this waterway on the east side of the river along 3rd Street, but on the east side of the river from what is now downtown Portland. And this would have been East Portland at the time. And it crosses this waterway, and if you look at the image, it looks like a very short waterway. It doesn't go that far, and it's kind of wide, and so it almost kind of looks like a lake branching off of the Willamette River. So as I'm researching the 3rd Street Bridge, I find references to Cooch Lake. So I'm like, oh, that must be Cooch Lake I'm seeing. So I start researching the 3rd Street Bridge as though it's more in the southeastern part of Portland. But then I started thinking, it just seemed odd to me that a lake would be named Cooch Lake down there, because Cooch Lake was named after Captain John Cooch, and most of his connections to Portland are in the northwest area. That's where Couch's Addition was. The original, I said Couch's Addition, couldn't stop myself. Cooch's Addition, the original Cooch School was up there. John Cooch himself lived up there. So it was weird that his primary association was with the northern or northwestern part of Portland. Why would there be a lake named after him in the southeast part? And then I also found references that stated that Tanner Creek actually ran into it. But Tanner Creek was on the west side of the Willamette River, and I'm thinking the Cooch Lake is on the east. So, like, what? Does the Tanner Creek water just leapfrog the Willamette River water to get to Cooch Lake? None of this was making any sense. So I was thinking something has to be wrong here. So I start researching Cooch Lake directly, and I see that during the mid-1890s it was filled in, specifically so they could build this new train station. And this particular area where I'm seeing this, what I thought was a lake on the east side, that area has been filled in. And there's all these railroad lines going through there, next to Division Street. It's just all railroad tracks, and the Orange Max line goes through there. So I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That checks out. It would make sense that there would have been a train station here once upon a time. It never occurred to me that them referencing filling something in to build a major train station in the 1890s, that they might be talking about Union Station, Portland's primary train station that opened in the 1890s. So I start looking back at old maps here and there, and it didn't take long before I realized Cooch Lake used to be right where Union Station is. And that is actually where the 3rd Street Bridge was. It was in the vicinity of Union Station. So that's one of the things about researching, especially when you're covering stuff you've never covered before. If you're looking into something new, keep researching, because you might find yourself thinking something went a certain way or is in a certain location, and as you dig, you may find that that is actually not quite accurate. That's why when it comes to history, among many other things, it's important to keep researching and do deep research so that you don't end up looking like a fool when all is said and done. Not that that's never happened to me before. But anyway, that was the process I had to go to find out that this particular bridge was not located here, but actually up here. So the 3rd Street Bridge ran north of the main hub of Portland, just beyond present-day Chinatown, and through where Union Station stands today. With work beginning in late 1880, come early 1881, this bridge would be completed, spanning across what was then known as Cooch Lake, or the place that Tanner Creek spilled into on the north end of town. So once upon a time, stupid train, once upon a time, pretty much all of this was underwater, because there used to be a lake here. We're coming to the end of the Burnside, walks right into that one, the Broadway Bridge. There's Nato Parkway, formerly Front Avenue. And of course, Union Station. Union Station, this used to all be Cooch Lake. And because of that, once upon a time, there was a bridge that crossed here. Similar to all the other waterways around here, there was a decent-sized lake through here, and people needed to be able to get from the city to parts further north. And Linton was established up here. People had reason to need to be up here. And instead of having to go around the lake, it was easier to just cut right through. That being said, you see this big white building, this thing right here. Now, to this side of it, that is where 3rd Avenue comes in. The old firehouse that they tore down was right there. And that's where 3rd Avenue is, so this would be 4th Avenue. So it's a little bit complicated because, once you get up here, everything kind of starts to turn a little bit. So I'm a little bit more in line, I would say. Well, this, I believe, becomes Broadway. So if you're thinking about 3rd Avenue being right here, it would have had to turn because, technically that's Front Avenue right there. So things get a little crunched up here, but probably roughly, if 3rd Avenue is coming from right there, it probably would have come. It would have been probably pretty close to in line with this little sidewalk here. I have a little piece to guide me, so it would have been just outside of Union Station, and this would have been about where the 3rd Street Bridge was that crossed Cooch Lake. And ultimately, the bridge was removed because they filled all of this land so that they could build the city's new train depot. You know, it would have been a decent-sized bridge. I mean, it was definitely reported on more than others. It was a bridge because a lot of these other bridges, they were crossing these tiny little gulches that most of the time were maybe a block wide at the most. But this was a bridge crossing a lake, so that was kind of a new undertaking at that time. But it helped get people from within the city, the main city, to parts further north, and for people further north that needed to get into town, probably to work, especially if they lived out here, you had kind of a quick through way to get into town. Despite the bridge only being completed in early 1881, a September 23, 1884 Oregonian piece stated the bridge was in the process of being torn down. It would be another decade before Couch Lake was filled in for the completion of Union Station, so that was clearly not the cause of this bridge's demise. It could have been, as I later found out doing some last-minute covering all my bases research, that there were other bridges in the vicinity of Couch Lake. Namely, there was an N Street Bridge to the north end of the lake, which dates back to 1881. Obviously, the size of a bridge did not translate to popularity, so to speak, as this was one of the last bridges I discovered in my research, but it was also the longest bridge in town at the time of its completion, reportedly running 1,450 feet in length, or just over 7 downtown Portland-sized city blocks. It was said to run between 11th and Front Streets. By April 1881, the bridge was done and said to be a significant route for those in the Watson Addition, just north of the main city of Portland, to use to get around. Like the others, it had its problems, in need of serious work both in 1886 and in 1888. While many of the bridges I discuss here were gone by the 1891 city annexation of Albina and East Portland, wherein many street names were changed, the N Street Bridge is a rare example where it existed beyond that time and thus would become the Northrop Street Bridge. By 1893, it was falling apart and needed to be replaced. Its length probably made it even more of a headache to maintain than the others. But with Couch Lake being filled in, this bridge shrunk in length, dwindling down to only 3 blocks in length, still longer than most bridges in town at that time. 1903 would see the bridge receive a major overhaul, even though many felt the land should be just filled in beneath it, removing the bridge altogether. But fixing it was probably cheaper at the time, considering the amount of fill they would have needed. But come 1906, with a massive rail yard developed in the rest of the area where the lake used to be, this bridge would finally be put out of its misery. With more fill being put in, the Northrop Street Bridge was torn down and burned. But this bridge ran north of the lake and ran east and west, while the 3rd Street Bridge ran north and south. But come 1886, a bridge running parallel to where the 3rd Street one did was in the works, running down 7th Street, or Broadway today. It appears there were several issues and delays preventing completion of the bridge until 1888, taking some 2 years to finish. And almost immediately it drew a high amount of traffic, as by this time, it was the only north-south traveling bridge in the Couch Lake area. That said, it would be another casualty of the Couch Lake infill, with the last report I found on it being from July 19th, 1895, noting that the bridge was little more than a cavity at this point. With more traffic crossing the Tanner Creek Gulch around B Street in Washington, even after these bridges were closed down, the fill work done allowed locals to still use this as a primary route. This may explain why there were few bridges existing due south of there before the creek turned sharply into the Markham Gulch towards the river. In fact, I can only verify that there was one, that being the Chapman Street Bridge, which today would have run along 18th Avenue between Taylor and Main Streets. Alright, who wants to see some soccer? I don't think there's a soccer game happening right now. We're about to walk up next to Providence Park. Or the former location of what was called the Chapman Street Bridge. I don't know why I put so much distance between Chap and Man. Chapman, which was named after J.A. Chapman. He was multiple term mayor of Portland. I don't remember how many times he got elected mayor of Portland. And he owned some of the land with Daniel Lounsdale in the South Park block. So most of that land was donated by Lounsdale's, J.A. Chapman and Stephen Coffin. But in the Plaza blocks, you have a Lounsdale Square and a Chapman Square, and that's also named after J.A. Chapman. So for a while, there was actually 13th. I believe it was 13th. Having to call back on some old memories, but one of the streets through here used to be Lounsdale. It used to be named after Lounsdale. And 18th, it would have been 18th Street then, but 18th Avenue today was known as Chapman Street. And Portland was very big, especially back in the day. Even during the great renumbering of that ultimately was completed in 1933, they made a big deal of not wanting to name streets that have been named after like early settlers here, Portland pioneers. Not renaming streets that were named after people like that. Alas, Lounsdale is by name no longer exists, and Chapman Street no longer exists. It is now 18th, and there was a Chapman Street Bridge located on 18th between Taylor and Main Streets. Here's Providence Park, so I know I'm close. See some of the stands in there a little bit. But yeah, this used to be Chapman, and the next street up here is Taylor. So right up here, and the street kind of hooks a little bit. It probably wasn't like that once upon a time. Old maps show it going in a straight line. It probably just has to do with all the expansions that have gone on here. The new Lincoln High School is right over here. And of course, I'm coming down here and vlogging right when frickin' school gets out. But it is what it is. So as we come to the south end of Providence Park, here's about where the bridge would have started and would have gone these 2 blocks dead ahead of me. So yeah, this would have, again, I don't know if it probably didn't start right at Taylor and end right at Main, but it's probably a pretty long bridge. I'm having to make this a little choppy just because there's high school kids everywhere, but fortunately they're mostly all behind me now as I come to what would have been the southern edge of the Chapman Street Bridge. Now just 18th and a way for the Max to go. And this more or less would have been where it ended. And I don't think the bridge was really around all that long. And I even barely qualify this bridge, as its earliest work happened in 1887. It barely made the cut, but while the B Street and Washington Street bridges sought to connect people with places further west, like Beaverton, the Chapman Street Bridge more specifically sought to connect people to the area known today as Goose Hollow. But back then it was considered a connection to people living in what was called King's Addition. Unfortunately, the bridge's particular placement along the creek would ultimately be its undoing. Located at a turn in the creek, in 1890 it would be blasted by a rush of water from a burst sewer that hit it with such momentum that it nearly carried the bridge away altogether. The supports sunk 3 feet down into the ground. The bridge was fixed up, only for fate to strike twice in the form of another sewer burst in March 1904, this time ripping the supports right out from under the bridge, leaving it barely holding on. It would be closed down for safety, and ultimately the remains would be left abandoned for some time, with this image from 1907, 3 years later, showing the area around where the bridge once was, just caved in and forgotten. But the Chapman Street Bridge may not have been the only one in this area. While I found no information to substantiate its existence, the 1879 drawing of Portland shows a bridge at Jefferson Street as it crossed the gulch over Tanner Creek. While this most certainly would have been called the Jefferson Street Bridge, I found nothing to prove it was real, but Jefferson Street did run in close proximity to the creek, and if it did cross it once upon a time, it most certainly would have been by bridge. Specifically, it was, I call it the unknown Jefferson Street Bridge, and it crossed between 13th and 14th Streets, which crosses over I-405 today. So again, imagery suggests it existed. I did a detailed search for a Jefferson Street Bridge and got absolutely nothing. And Jefferson Street is one of the streets, exists on the west side, not on the east side. So this was not an instance where I checked specifically just Jefferson Street Bridge in general, but not whether it was on the west side or not. But it would have, if it did exist, crossed between 14th, that's this crossing street right here, and 13th, which would be on the other side of I-405 today. So just a little dip in the earth that existed right around here. And they thought it more sensible to build a bridge. And like, yeah, there's an overpass here still, but like, I get that overpasses are bridges, but like, when you think of like the St. John's Bridge, and then like this, or even that one, like, do you really think of these as like bridges? I get that they are, but if you're driving down the freeway, you're not looking up and saying, hey, look at all these bridges we're going under. You're saying, look at all these overpasses. So I'm following my own system, which is that the bridge from the 1879 image, which may have not even existed, that was a bridge. This is just kind of, it's kind of a bridge. Anyway, maybe a bridge existed crossing here. Who knows? Maybe they built the bridge and never gave it a name because it was just a little crossing to go over like a dip in the earth. And maybe they just never bothered naming it. I really don't know. This Jefferson Street Bridge was one of a few that I could not prove existed while there was some visual representation for it. As a semi-transition into the next part, I found something very similar to this represented on the east side of the river. In this 1890 portrayal of Portland, we can see along the Stevens Slough, the Stevens Slough Bridge going north and south, but encountering another bridge that crossed the slough traveling east and west. This bridge ran perfectly in line with Division Street, which today turns north and ultimately runs into 3rd Avenue, but old maps show that once upon a time it continued west, all the way to the Willamette River. If this is true, then Division Street had to cross the Stevens Slough at some point. However, I found no information to show that a Division Street Bridge ever existed. Doesn't mean it didn't, though. To the east side of the river were the towns of East Portland, incorporated in 1871, and Albina to the north, incorporated in 1887, but originally established in the 1870s. While just about all the bridges to be discussed here existed in the East Portland area, there is another mystery bridge to be mentioned here, specifically one that connected Albina to places south of there, which included East Portland. This is another bridge I found no verification for, but in this instance, that simply means I never found out what the name was. But it was represented in more than one artist rendering, in close proximity to a railroad bridge, as well as in a Sanborn fire map from 1889. So there is little reason to doubt this bridge's existence, but what we know about it really ends there. It ran across the one-time Montgomery Slough, but did not have a name associated with it, and the slough itself would ultimately be filled in after many locals called the water there toxic. It's likely the bridge went not too long after that. But in relation to where the previous section ended, while it's possible a bridge on Division Street over Stevens Slough existed, there was once, perhaps for a fairly short time, a bridge that crossed this slough on 3rd Street. Known as the Stevens Slough Bridge, this name was shared with a bridge that came a short while later running 2 blocks east of there along today's Grand Avenue as it runs into Highway 99. However, this other bridge was more often simply referred to as the Stevens Bridge. So remember earlier, I did my little bit about my confusion. I thought the 3rd Street Bridge, because there was a bridge in a drawing of Portland that was on 3rd Street, would have crossed right up here. But I confused the waterway that did go through here. You can still see how it's kind of lowlands down here, and it's elevated up here, and further you go that way, it kind of starts elevating, but this is a low point, even though the waterway that was here was filled in. This is where the Stevens Slough used to come through, and I did not intend on making that rhyme. Really? Really? You gonna interrupt? You gonna interrupt me? It is what it is. Okay, before I was rudely interrupted by the train. This is where the Stevens Slough came through, and the bridge that I thought was the 3rd Street Bridge is actually, or was actually, the Stevens Slough Bridge. And I saw references to the Stevens Slough Bridge in newspapers and thought maybe that was a bridge somewhere else. There was a lot of bridges kind of scattered just north of here, and we're at what could be considered kind of the southern end of what was Stevens Addition. So it made sense. But this is where Grand Avenue and Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard come together to become just McLaughlin Boulevard going that way. And this is where, not too long later, this is where the first interurban streetcar line went through. I did a video on that a few months ago. It didn't originally, when the line originally started in the 1890s, but in 1904, they moved the line from going down and over to cutting right through here. So I'm right back where I was a couple months ago, which is a reoccurring pattern in my videos. I'll go to some spot, film something. A month or two later, I don't just have to go to the same area, I end up in the exact same spot. At this point, MLK and Grand Avenue have already come together. So technically this is strictly in line with 5th Avenue. So we're kind of more in line with 4th Avenue at this time. So as water wraps around, we start to come more in line with where 3rd Avenue would be. Actually, if I had to approximate it, obviously this is based on, the actual location is based on a drawing specifically. And I was just right over there, so I'm walking north. But the bridge probably would have been pretty close to inline. This is the present day streetcar as it climbs up and goes up over here. Right where it crosses Water Avenue here, but not turning like this, but more going not east and west, north and south, is about where the Stevens Slough Bridge would have been. You can see over there, the land still elevates, so we're still down in this kind of lull. But yeah, right about here. I don't know how, it probably wasn't, I mean, most of these bridges weren't at a very high elevation, just high enough to straddle above the water, so I doubt the bridge would have been much higher than maybe even the rooftop of this red building over here, but it probably would have been starting down there and just cutting across right here. And so the Stephen Slough Bridge coming down 3rd Street and then crossing right here, anybody around here or on the other side of the slough, this would have been the primary bridge that would have gotten you from here to over there without having to go way down to another bridge or wrap all the way around the slough. So to get to that side and start heading more into the Brooklyn neighborhood towards Selwood and whatever was developed down there, this bridge was really important. And in further relation to Stephen Slough, which would have just been moving through here, you've got the bridge that would have crossed, and again, kind of where the streetcar line came down, sort of towards the other end of this platform is probably where it would have crossed. Well, one of the few bridges I found on these old map drawings that, try as I might, search as hard as I did, I could not find any info on, probably either because, I don't know, maybe the artists of these maps took a few liberties, or I just couldn't determine the name of the bridge. But while the 3rd Street Bridge was going north and south, there was another bridge going east and west, and the two, again, according to the drawing, crossed or encountered each other. I guess they intersected with each other on the south side of the slough, so probably somewhere over here. And the bridge that was going east and west over the slough, it roughly lines up with Division over here, but I looked up Division Street Bridge, I looked up all these little streets down here, all these streets over here, because that's pretty much what they called these bridges. It was just whatever street the bridge was on, that was the name it had. And I found absolutely nothing. But yeah, the bridge would have crossed, if it did in fact exist, probably somewhere along this block between this one and the next one down. It would have crossed, and then over here would have been just the south side of Stephen Slough. And so that bridge would have come in, and then the 3rd Street one would have come in, and they would have intersected somewhere over this rather large parking lot. This was another bridge that just barely qualified for this video, as construction began on it in 1887, but due to inclement weather and some flooding of the slough, completion was delayed and it would not be operational until 1888. Possible shoddy construction work may have been a reason this bridge was not around long, as an 1890 article discussed how the bridge swayed a lot when teams would pass over it, suggesting the braces on it were coming loose. Another reason it may have not been around long was the creation of this other bridge just a few blocks over, which was located along a more prominent stretch of road. This bridge's main purpose was a quick crossing over the slough for people who needed to get to the other side, but this bridge on Grand Avenue served the same purpose. And there may have even been another bridge in this area, also serving the purpose of providing a quick way across the slough heading south, but predating the Stephen Slough Bridge. In the 1879 drawing of the city, there is a distinct bridge crossing the slough near where it meets the river, following the route of Water Street. And while we're discussing Water Street Bridge, I'm right back down here. I'm wading through Stephen Slough again down by Omsey, where the 3rd Street Bridge would have crossed right here. Well, according to the 1879 drawing, there was another place right down here where Water Street crossed Stephen Slough. So it would have pretty much been, because Water Street over by Omsey here starts to wrap around and comes in back here. But technically Water Avenue, if it continued, it would just go right through Omsey. Approaching the Tillicum Crossing, over 39,000 cyclists this year. But because it was Water Street and not Water Avenue, it became Water Avenue, because it was Water Street and not 3rd Street, this bridge would have it would have crossed much closer to the water. So yeah, you've got Almsey right over here. Pretty much Water Street would have come right through here. Obviously, Almsey wasn't here in the 1800s. So the bridge would have been probably somewhere between roughly where Almsey is and fairly close to where I am now, because I feel like I'm kind of towards generally where the north end of the Stevens Slough would have been. Now, I don't know if this bridge had a name, because the Water Street Bridge, in, you know, newspaper articles, information I found, was further north of here. But according to the 1879 artist rendering, there was a Water Street Bridge right here, and it makes sense because that would have been here even before the 3rd Street Bridge, and it would have served a similar purpose, trying to get people headed this direction without having to wade through the slough or go way down there and kind of go around it. And just for reference, because I mean, two of my primary sources are two hand-drawn representations of Portland, one from 1879, one from 1890. Now, I'm not using these as like bona fide, 100% accurate resources, but more, I'm kind of using them the way you might use like Wikipedia. Like, you don't want to use just straight Wikipedia as a source, because you never know who's putting the info on there. Sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not, but Wikipedia can be a good jumping off point, because you can go to a Wikipedia article and then see what their references are, and sometimes those references are really good resources, and it gives you a jumping off point. And that's what I use these I mean, this is where I first got the idea from, was looking at these old drawn maps. But on the maps you can see exactly where these bridges were, what streets they were on, what streets they crossed, what gulches, creeks, lakes they crossed. And so you had all these little bits of information that you could research and try to verify, did these actually exist or not? And that was how I was able to, you know, first really start taking off on this project. Dating back to 1871 was another bridge that went under the name of the Water Street Bridge, which technically ran several blocks down by the lowlands along the river. But most information notes the bridge as existing primarily between J and L Streets, or Oak and Washington Streets today. But imagery shows not only Water Street, but other streets near the river with long stretches, such as this, wherein they weren't referred to as bridges. In this 1889 Sanborn Fire map, which references bridges in numerous areas, it only describes this stretch south of L Street as a plank drive, elevated 5 feet above ground. So, elevated, bridge-like, but not really considered a bridge. And this was hardly the only instance where we see this in these old maps. The first few blocks back from the river were clearly lower than lands beyond that, as we see these elevated plank roads periodically between 3rd Street and the river. The portion primarily considered as the bridge, running 2 blocks between J and L Streets, ran across the head of the Hawthorne Slough. It was completed in the summer of 1871, at close to the same time as the L Street Bridge, another one I will discuss, for around a combined total of $18,000. Especially with being down by the river, it faced the same issues and necessary repairs as others, with a portion of it on the verge of collapse in 1880. It was also heavily damaged during the 1876 flood, which at the time was the worst flood on record in Portland's history, not outdone until the flood of 1894. In fact, when the bridge was rebuilt in 1884, a point was made to build it at an increased elevation using the 76 flood levels as a marker. At a cost of $15,000, this was also the nearest bridge to the Stark Street Ferry, the primary method of transport across the Willamette River prior to the construction of the first Morrison Bridge. In fact, the latest information I found in relation to the Water Street Bridge was in 1886, specifically discussing how Water Street would run into where the new Morrison Bridge would be built along its east side approach. It's possible the bridge may have been drastically altered during the construction of the Morrison, and thus no references afterward. the 1890 rendering of the city, if it is to be relied on, still shows Water Street elevated south of the Morrison Bridge, but it appears the area between J and L Streets was elevated still, but more developed, with buildings standing between Water Street and the river. In the 1889 Sanborn Fire Maps, it describes this stretch of Water Street as a street built on piers. In short, everything in the immediate area was elevated on piers above the lowlands, also a probable response to the likes of the 1876 flood. So the Water Street Bridge. The artist renderings I've had of it showed that because it was right on the water. It shows that First Street, right parallel to it, also was elevated for a while, and it implied that it went for you can see it. It was several blocks of it being elevated. It's almost just like a dock just kind of dangling over the river. And that rendering suggests that that bridge ran all the way from Oak to Salmon Street, which Salmon Street's, this is Main Street, so the next one is Salmon. So it went from there several blocks that way. But all of these specifics, the information I found about the Water Street Bridge suggested it went over a 2-block stretch between J and L Street. Now, J was Oak Street, K would have been Stark, and L would be Washington. So in today's geography, the Water Street Bridge, as we know it, would have crossed along Water Street between Oak and Washington. And so alas here, because we see really loud Water Avenue, formerly Water Street, if it kept going this way, it would just be plowing into I-5 right here. So it shifts over, which is so convenient because the next street right here is Washington, which would have been the southern edge of the bridge. So the bridge in question, approximately, would have cut right through here where I-5 is now. It would have just cut and kept going that way for approximately 2 blocks, as history would say. And it just ends another block down and wraps around. I knew that. I don't know why I'm acting like I forgot where formerly Water Street ended. But yeah, you see we're at Water and Washington Street, formerly L Street. So yeah, it would have just kind of started cutting right across and just kept kind of going. See this off ramp? There's the wall there. It kind of would have been going right into that. Past Stark, where Water Avenue today ends and wraps around, and it would have continued 1 block further down. But again, kind of more going in that direction. Just people on their horses, just equestrianing, if that's a word. It's not, I don't think, their way through the freeway traffic, creating the world's greatest pileup. There were horses loose on the freeway today, with some men dressed in very traditionally like 1870s, 1880s attire. I don't know where I'm going with this. Just kind of following the route as far as I can, because this is where it ends for the amateur historian. But yeah, the bridge would have just kind of kept going that way, and that would have been historically where the Water Street Bridge is regarded as being, starting right over there, cutting the freeway, and then down to the vicinity of Oak Street. To the north end of the Water Street Bridge, again, was J Street, today's Oak Street. This route represented a bridge that I almost missed, only discovering it while researching another. As the Hawthorne Slough wrapped through the middle of East Portland, it passed in close proximity to J Street. We can see in this map of the 1894 flood where the slough flooded the area of the former J Street between Union Avenue, formerly 4th Street, and 6th Street. An 1885 Oregonian article helped verify this as the site of the bridge, noting the bridge ran in the area of 4th and 5th Streets. Dating back as far as early 1871, this is another bridge with little information available about it. It was another bridge in frequent need of repairs. In fact, the last information I found in relation to this bridge was about some repairs to be done on it in 1885. And the Sanborn Fire map of just a couple years later makes no reference of a bridge at this site along J Street, suggesting it was long gone or possibly some fill had been made along the slough so that a bridge was no longer necessary. Another bridge, completed in 1871, in the summer of that year, was the U Street Bridge. This bridge ran along what is today Hawthorne Boulevard and was, for a time, referred to as Asylum Avenue as it led to the Oregon Hospital for the Insane, run by Dr. James Hawthorne, once located near what would have been 12th and U Streets. In fact, when the bridge was built, one of the main reasons for it was to provide a direct route to the asylum. While in the following video, I was not sure exactly where the bridge was located at that time, my approximation was accurate as it was fairly close to the river. Now we're going deep underground. So this is, well, it's Hawthorne Boulevard technically. This is the elevated route going to the Hawthorne Bridge, which makes sense, but it's Hawthorne Boulevard running underneath here. And this would have been the general site. I love the old rails still here. This would have been the general area of what would a long time ago been known as the U Street Bridge, which U Street was a former name of Hawthorne Avenue before it became Hawthorne Boulevard. Now this is one of the few bridges, also it wouldn't have been as high elevation as this. A lot of these bridges they didn't build too high, unless they were going over a gulch and then they just kind of kept it, street level, I guess. But a lot of bridges they didn't really have that high elevation. Now this is the one bridge where I could never decipher an exact location, but they said it was close to the waterfront, which is right up there. So it probably wouldn't have been any further. This is Water Avenue right here. It probably wouldn't have been any further back than First Avenue's the next, well, it's not really a road because it's just a railroad crossing, but it would be First Avenue and then Second. It was probably no further east than Third Avenue because they just said the bridge was close to the waterfront and people would use this bridge in particular to try to get to the ferry. And there were a lot of bridges that a lot of the bridges they built pretty much looked like docks, but a lot of bridges that existed, a lot of them would be between such and such, it'd be along one of these streets, no further back than First, which this would be, or Second or something. And I think most of them were pretty much, they were called bridges, but they were just docks going to the waterfront. But this was a little bit different from that because this existed and actually ended before you got to the actual river itself. This bridge, in fact, ran between 1st and 3rd Streets. It crossed over some lowlands before crossing 1st and Water Streets and leading down to the river, as it was another site that the Stark Street Ferry was to arrive at. This may have been another motivation for building this bridge, which was providing a direct route to this ferry site. With a state hospital just down the road with patients coming from all around, it wouldn't surprise me if some were transported to this vicinity via the ferry and then taken directly down U Street to the hospital. 1886 would really show how, seemingly blissfully unaware, some were to the dangers of unstable bridges. With the U Street Bridge deemed so dangerous that a new one needed to be built, an injunction was passed to stop it. And when the local council managed to pass a resolution to once again proceed on this matter, another injunction was passed by a local named Joseph Paquette, making the common argument at the time that the city shouldn't have to pay for it, but rather the property owners in the bridge's vicinity should have to pay. The town was in a quandary as their actions kept being stopped, but if they just allowed the bridge to continue to rot away, someone was going to get hurt, and then that responsibility would be put on them as well. They would finally get around this and construct a new bridge, but even by the autumn of 1887, it needed work done. It would stick around a while longer, even after the Madison Street Bridge was built, aligning with Madison Street just one block north of U Street, which would become Hawthorne Avenue for a while. This meant that, in the years before the Hawthorne Bridge would replace the Madison Street Bridge, there was once a Hawthorne Avenue Bridge in existence. Completed the year after the U Street Bridge was the L Street Bridge, running along L Street or today's Washington Street. This work's origin came from an 1871 plan to make improvements along the street heading in the direction of, as they put it, the cemeteries, and this included the need for building a bridge. I know if one traveled as far east as present-day 20th Avenue along this stretch, they would have reached the Lone Fir Cemetery at its old and original entrance. This is likely one of the cemeteries being referred to. The general idea was that funeral processions could then be held going down L Street, but due to the Hawthorne sloughs wrapping back and forth, this bridge would actually have to be more than just one bridge. So, Washington Street, in our case, present-day Southeast Washington Street, and it's kind of crazy because you go to the west side of the river in downtown, Washington Street was one of the most, especially in the earlier years of the city in the 1800s, Washington Street was one of the most prominent streets in town, if not the, at certain times. But on little east side, slowly developing east side over here, this was just L Street. But L Street, sorry, I'm yelling because I'm trying to get away from all the traffic. L Street, again, according to artist renderings, actually had two short bridges that happened just a couple blocks apart. And it was because right through here is where another slough used to be, which was called the Hawthorne Slough. We're walking east now on Washington, formerly L Street. I'm going to show you the two spots where these bridges are shown to have been. And this was tough because, it would have been tough if this had been post 1891 that this bridge would have been built, because that's when this became Washington Street on the east side. There was already a Washington Street Bridge on the west side. There could have been two Washington Street bridges, and they weren't exactly great at in old resources stating whether one was on the east side or on the west side. Oh, I haven't seen this place in so long. Barber Block. There used to be like an undertaker establishment in here. It's one of the coolest buildings. It's on Washington. I'm pretty much right where they're getting right to where the bridge was. And this is an old building. It's history. Oh, I forget how dicey it gets over on Grand Avenue, like right there specifically. Anyway, just crossed Grand Avenue. And so this would be 6th. And then, oh, and I think this is where like Sandy starts up here. But anyway, right up here is where, again, according to artistic representation, and I didn't find any information to specifically dispute it, while finding evidence that there was at least an L Street Bridge over here. It's, right here where this kind of chaos is. This is 7th Avenue crossing, and between 7th and 8th is where L Street crossed the winding and weaving through town Hawthorne Slough. crossing 7th-ish Sandy. This would have been a bridge, a little bridge right here. From, roughly here-ish to just the next block. So it wouldn't have been a massive bridge, but this would have been where it crossed the slough. And the slough essentially wrapped under it here, wrapped around, and then crossed right under Washington Street, or L Street. Again, just one block down. But yeah, this next street up, this should be 9th. And between 9th and 10th here, there was also, it's where Hawthorne slough crossed under again. This is Washington and 9th, right? Yes, good. So right here, this would have been the second bridge that I'd be walking through. Or walking over, I guess. That went between 9th and 10th. I think that was it. And actually, in the distance, you can see the old George Washington High School right up here, a few blocks up. Yeah, this block is definitely, today it's a little bit longer. I don't know how it would have been back in, the 1800s. The artist rendering kind of shows bridges of similar distance. But yeah, this second one would have been 9th to 10th Avenue, and here's 10th Avenue right here. So we just crossed ourselves another bridge. Historically, down there somewhere. Right down 10th. Come July 1872, this double bridge was completed and described at the time as a very imposing structure on one of the main throughways on the east side. It was reported that on September 30th, 1880, while visiting the city, then President Rutherford B. Hayes departed a train and, in a procession of carriages, crossed these bridges headed for the ferry to cross the river into then Portland. Necessary repairs would come along the way, again with complications over whether the city or local property owners should cover the expenses. This would also be another bridge, or bridge set, I guess, that lasted on into the 1890s, something that couldn't be said for some. After 1891, when the alphabetized streets on the east side were renamed, this bridge would become better known as the East Side Washington Street Bridge. As far as I could gather, this bridge existed at least until the near end of the 1890s. The dawn of the 1870s was the key period for early bridge construction on the east side, with 5 of the 7 bridges I will mainly be focusing on having been built between 1871 and 1872. And while I mentioned previously that a key difference between east and west side bridges was where they were, and that the east side bridges were more in town, one key difference to this norm was a bridge built over Sullivan's Gulch in 1882 that would be known as the 16th Street Bridge. At this time, with East Portland being fairly small and even narrow, 16th Street, while only a short distance from the river, was on the outskirts of town. But with things gradually expanding east, there were more people living out here, and this bridge provided quick access for people living out east from one side of the gulch to the other. So I'm approaching, this is 12th Avenue crossing Sullivan's Gulch, crossing railroad lines, max lines, I-84. It's probably about the best view I'm really going to get of where a bridge used to be 4 blocks east on 16th. There wasn't really a whole lot going on out there, so I'm going to try to get as good of a view of it as I can. 16th does technically wrap around over here, kind of wraps around the backside of where Lloyd Center is. But because there's no bridge there anymore, 16th kind of wraps and then turns and goes this way. So it actually, I don't remember if it's Lloyd Boulevard right here, but it would be about 4 blocks down. And it'd be about where the off-ramp is, bringing people up here. So right there, that off-ramp, that's about where 16th would cross over. So right in that vicinity, that is where the 16th Street Bridge would have crossed once upon a time. And, I mean, later there was a 12th Street Bridge right here too, but I think it came later, and also it's never gone away, and that's one of my stipulations, is I want it to be bridges that are no longer here, with two small exceptions, which are actually right behind me. You can see a better view of the overpass right there, or the off-ramp. That's about where it would have been, crossing right there. Come 1890, despite being in an advanced stage of decay, it was decided the bridge could not be closed until the nearby 12th Street Bridge could finish being fixed up. Ultimately, by the end of the 1880s, there would be 5 bridges between 2nd and 16th Streets, and rarely were all 5 in good working order at the same time. For a time in 1888, only a 2nd Street Bridge and the 16th Street Bridge were functioning. The Sullivan's Gulch, the deepest crossing these early bridges had to cross, really took a toll on those early crossings. Long after the original 1882 bridge was closed down and done away with, there were actually plans to build a fairly elaborate replacement bridge across the gulch along 16th Avenue, which took off in 1912. The bridge would have been about 160 feet long and cost approximately $100,000. But come 1913, the city found itself almost out of bridge funds, again, and the harsh truth was addressed that such a bridge would have to be mostly paid off with tax money. This was during a time where locals were particularly fickle about where they wanted their tax money going, and with them voting down another bridge across the Willamette shortly before this, the odds of them supporting a bridge that honestly was not all that necessary was next to zero. And thus, the project faded away. And here's the one time where I kind of cheat my rule about specifically wanting it to be old bridges pre-1887, but also old bridges where there's not another bridge there today. So they're kind of lost bridges, because even in the late 1800s, there were multiple places where bridges were built and then replaced by later bridges, and you know, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, whichever version of the bridge exists today, is still there. So the one distinction to that, because it's too prominent to the whole story of like Portland's early bridges, pre-1887 Morrison Bridge, and that is what was known as the 4th and 5th Street bridges right down here, and is today where Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard and Union Avenue, it's the old name of Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, I'm mixing my names up. It's where Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard and Grand Avenue cross, with Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard being the stretch formerly known as 4th Street, and then Grand Avenue used to be 5th Street. And they still cross Sullivan's Gulch here today, but my history is focused on the history. My video today is focused on the history leading up to the period right before the present day crossings were built. The two bridges that crossed side by side once upon a time as the 4th and 5th Street bridges, and those that followed, have been synonymous with one another since 1884, when the 5th Street Bridge was completed. The 4th Street Bridge had, like a few others, existed since 1871. It was the first bridge erected crossing Sullivan's Gulch, providing a connection to nearby Holliday's Addition and further on to the town of Albina. In fact, the main objective of this bridge was clearly to promote Holliday's Addition, with Ben Holliday himself contributing $3,000 to the project. It was promoted as one of the greatest bridges in town, running about 400 feet in length, and also being one of the area's tallest bridges. It would ultimately be completed in September of 1871. Par for the course, come the following year, it was already in desperate need of repairs, and repairs were not always perfect. With the bridge giving way at its center, repairs in January 1880 were said to put it back in perfect working order. Such set the stage for perhaps the most tragic story to come from these early bridges. On August 4th, 1880, 8-year-old Rosa Rankin fell through an opening when a sidewalk plank that had not been properly attached flipped up under her feet. She fell 40 feet to the shallow slough below, her body later found downstream. Fortunately, with a future full of repairs, history in this instance would not repeat itself. After more than a decade of standing alone, come February 1884, 1 block east, the 5th Street Bridge was completed. However, this bridge would not initially receive the same fanfare as the one next to it. Upon completion and inspection, the city refused to accept the bridge as it had not been built according to their contract. A lawsuit followed by the city against the construction crew, which would drag out until 1887, when the state Supreme Court determined the bridge had been done properly and that the city had to pay it off. But with them still deeming the bridge not properly done and even unsafe, the city was in a rough place of having to pay for a bridge they didn't feel they could even use. Yet. So, since I'm coming in from the east, it's Grand Avenue first, and then Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard's the next street down. It's another damn board. Just walking past a guy that had like 2 machetes hanging off of him. So this is present day. This is the Grand Avenue crossing. MLK's just 1 block down, 1 block west, right over there. This is where 5th Street crossed once upon a time. And one of the primary purposes for both of these bridges was railroad. They were railroad bridges mostly, which that's another thing that kind of distinguishes. The streetcar goes down this one today, but railroads, early streetcar lines, those were very prominent along these the 2 bridges here. Making sure Mr. Double Machete isn't following me. He seemed to be kind of living in his own world, but I don't want that behind me. Grand Avenue over there. Here's MLK today, formerly 4th Street. Crossing Sullivan's Gulch, which has been widened over time in history. It was not quite this wide, but it's been widened. There's more trains coming through, more street traffic. But in the case of the 5th Street Bridge problem, the Willamette Bridge Railway Company would take over the project, starting new work on the bridge in 1888, which included embankment work that required full removal of a portion of the completed bridge. This work was deemed even more urgent as, in this same year, the 4th Street Bridge was closed down for being unsafe. It was said to be liable to pull apart and collapse at any moment. And while the 5th Street Bridge was mainly a railroad bridge, there was enough space for pedestrian traffic. After a month, the 4th Street Bridge, which had begun to sag, was brought back to a level point and opened again, with the city saying it was in great shape and would be good to go for years to come. And then a month later, a truck crossing it broke planks and nearly fell through to the slough below. More repairs followed. This would be the bulk of the history of these two early bridges, trying to coexist with each other and yet seldom in good shape at the same time. And while the 5th would be a railroad bridge from the moment it was finally operational, the 4th would later become a streetcar bridge, providing streetcar access to multiple parts to the north. The 4th Street Bridge would also serve one of the most absurd examples of delaying the inevitable: the need for a new bridge. In 1891, the city's street commissioner personally closed down the bridge, calling it so run down and dangerous that it was pointless to even fix and that a new bridge was urgently needed. That was in 1891. That new bridge would not come until 1908. And no, this bridge was not closed that whole time. After Portland annexed East Portland and Albina in 1891, many street name changes occurred, which included 4th Street becoming Union Avenue, and later Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, and 5th Street becoming Grand Avenue, and the bridge names changed as such. As early as 1893, serious talks began for a new Union Avenue bridge, and yet somehow it was reported this same year that the bridge had been fixed up and was in the best shape it had been in years. We've seen this before. By 1895, it was settling again, and in 1896, it was in such rough shape that newspapers posted reports frequently asking people not to go out on the bridge, especially children. In the summer of 1898, once again, it was fixed up and in great shape. Less than 2 years later, the timber supports were decayed and needed replacing. And with this inconsistent recent past, the condition of the Union Avenue Bridge was about to get even shakier. In the summer of 1902, the Grand Avenue Bridge was ordered closed by Portland City Engineer and barricaded. This put a lot of pressure on the failing Union Avenue Bridge to now carry the traffic of both bridges. All the stops were pulled out to keep it standing, and it became more and more clear that both of these bridges needed replacing. The plan was to replace the closed-down Grand Avenue one first, but before this could happen, on March 19, 1904, a major windstorm blew through town, causing extensive damage around the city, including collapsing much of what was left of the old Grand Avenue Bridge. It would be more than 3 years before the new bridge was built, completed in the summer of 1907. For most of this time, the gutted remains of the old bridge were left there, as a reminder of the decayed state of things in Sullivan's Gulch. But the completion of this bridge finally opened the window for Union Avenue to get a replacement as well, a bridge that would be completed the following year. And these two bridges remain to this day. My decision to include these two bridges, despite the fact that there are still bridges here to this day, was because of the significance of both of them. For their time, they were some of the tallest and longest bridges in the city, while also representing a major connection between two towns. Not all that different than creating a bridge crossing the Willamette to connect two towns. Oh, and one last thing. If things weren't confusing enough, I discovered another bridge along 4th Street that ran across the Hawthorne Slough between J and L Streets. This bridge dates back as far as 1873, and possibly earlier, and was replaced in the late 1870s. And it was also just called the 4th Street Bridge. So in a few instances, I found information that I couldn't use because I could not verify which 4th Street Bridge was being discussed, and there wasn't enough information to make an inference on the matter. In my research, I found references to at least one bridge that I questioned whether or not it was even finished, and references to a few other bridge projects of which I found no evidence they were actually built. Not even a bridge popping up in one of these old drawings. The one that definitely at least began construction, but I'm not fully convinced was ever finished, was a bridge known as the Q Street Bridge on the west side, on a route that would later become Quimby Street. This was another bridge planned to cross the vicinity of Couch Lake. With plans established in 1880, this was to be a 1,000-foot-long bridge, one of the longest in the city. Work began in the spring and carried on into the summer, but was constantly delayed by storm damage and high waters from the lake. And come September, the work on the bridge was rejected by the city's superintendent of streets, saying it did not follow the requirements of the ordinance made to build the bridge in the first place. And there was nothing of note to suggest that this issue was addressed and fixed. The only evidence I found to suggest this bridge was finished was from an April 16, 1885 Oregonian in a small blip where it was stated this bridge had been in operation successfully for 5 years. But that was it. Nothing else. Just one reference in an old newspaper. And in the 1889 Sanborn fire maps, there is no indication a bridge or even an elevated plank road was located here. Maybe the bridge was gone by this point and had actually been completed, but the remarkable lack of any further references leaves me not fully convinced. Aside from this, there were a couple bridge projects I found references to, but no evidence they ever happened. In a September 28, 1878 newspaper article, I found a small piece stating a contract had been awarded to build a bridge on S Street, later Xavier Street. This is the only information I found about this proposed bridge. In a July 4, 1886 newspaper article, Happy Independence Day, there was reference made to a long projected bridge project on T Street to primarily be used as a railroad and pedestrian combo bridge. I found no further information in relation to a T Street bridge being built. But this one article also mentioned how this bridge was to benefit the east side, meaning it was in relation to the east side, T Street. It just so happened this street would later become Madison Street, lining up with the Madison Street Bridge that would begin construction only 4 years later. It's at least a slight wonder then if this was an early reference to something smaller that later blossomed into this bridge. I doubt it, but the alignment is interesting. And then in March of 1882, plans to improve 10th Street on the west side between G and M Streets were reported, which included building a bridge across Tanner Creek. I found no further information on this or a 10th Street bridge on the west side, and was led to think this was another one that never happened. Until I checked the 1889 Sanborn fire maps. There I found that there was a small bridge located at where 10th Street met H Street, where the two crossed Tanner Creek. So it looks like this one actually did exist after all. In many ways, immersions such as this are some of my favorite videos to make. At this point, most of the research I do on various subjects is fairly straightforward, or at least partially delves into something I have previous knowledge about. But in this one, I was leaping into a void of history, very much foreign to me, and it had me stumbling here and there, while also periodically doing second, third, and even fourth checks on things that otherwise might have been routine, just to make sure I wasn't missing something. I was further engaged by the fact that a lot of the bridges and even places I discuss here are hardly referenced anywhere else online. And despite the length of this video, which was far longer than I initially intended, for all I know, this may just be the tip of the iceberg in terms of a complete history on this subject of Portland's earliest bridges, because a lot of the information is so scant in places. There's so much that is unknown. Most importantly, it's unknown exactly who built these bridges or what their backgrounds were. It's a fascination and a frustration when it comes to diving back into the earlier days of an American city. But it was a fun ride.